Hey everybody, let's talk Portuguese. If you have ever heard a Brazilian talk, chances are that you have probably heard somebody say the words mas and mais both as mais. This is especially true of people from places like Rio de Janeiro, but today I wanted to talk all about that glide. So when you hear Brazilian speakers say things like rapaz or fecho for rapaz and fecho, what they're doing is adding a quick y sound. This is called a glide, and it is a phenomenon that is related to epentes in Portuguese, which I have talked about on this channel previously. The glide simply makes a vowel sound turn into a diphthong. You can think of a glide as one vowel sound gliding into another. If in English you've ever heard the vowels described as A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y, that sometimes Y is the best example that we have of a semivowel. The semivowel can act as a vowel sound or a consonant depending on its location in a word. We will get into this in a moment, but in Portuguese, the glide is most often conditioned by a palatalized consonant coming after it. I'm talking about the s or z sounds, or even sh and j. But to take a step back for a moment, let's look at the glide and where it is most often heard. The glide is a very characteristic part of many Brazilian accents, especially accents like those from Rio de Janeiro. Indeed, the glide in Carioca speech was already well established in the early 1900s. This sound change is one of the major sound changes that had already occurred in the Carioca accent and others that were influenced by it by the early 1900s. But there are other regions in which a glide exists in Brazil as well. There are parts of the northeast of Brazil where this glide already existed as well in the early 1900s, independent of the Carioca speech. In the case of these northeastern accents, the variable is not in fact whether there is a glide or not, but whether the S at the end of a word is pronounced or not. The glide is always present, so you can get words like rapaz or rapaz. And this speaks to the great variability in Brazilian accents, especially with regard to the glide. Not all Brazilian speakers will insert this sound at the end of a word ending in S. And the history of the glide in Brazil is one that parallels a lot of the sound changes that happened in Brazilian Portuguese that I've already talked about on this channel. If you'd like to see more about that, you can see the videos that I did about the evolution of Brazilian Portuguese, especially the evolution of Brazilian pronunciation, in the little I up there above. As with many sound changes in Brazilian Portuguese, a more widespread adoption of the glide was set forth by mass communication, the advent of the radio and the TV, and the prestige of the Carioca accent would lead to more people adopting this manner of speech. This kind of phonetic diffusion has had a slow but steady influence on the speech of people throughout Brazil. Traditionally, however, this glide is not present in the accents of São Paulo all the way through the south of Brazil. The southernmost regions of Brazil only began to acquire this specific type of glide with the advent of mass communication and a phonetic diffusion. There are some isolated cases in the south of Brazil, such as the Azorian-influenced speech of Santa Catarina. However, it is debatable as to the origin of the glide that is present in those accents. However, it remains to be said that from São Paulo through to the south, if somebody were to be speaking with a glide, it would be seen as popular speech and not what we call fala culta. The educated speech from São Paulo through to the south is one that did not include this feature. But as you may have guessed if you've seen my other videos about Brazilian pronunciation, the spread of the glide coincides with the spread of palatalization in Brazilian speech. Brazilian accents that feature heavier palatalization are more likely to feature a glide because that word final S is one of the most distinguishably palatalized consonants in Brazilian speech. This is why it is no coincidence that the glide pops up most thoroughly and earliest in Carioca speech. With the spread of further palatalization across Brazil, and especially in cities, the glide has come along with it in varying degrees. Generally speaking, the further south you go, the less people use the glide in their day-to-day speech. The glide in those regions is often conditioned by which vowel is coming before the word final S. So although a word like mush will often frequently be pronounced like mais in urban speech regardless of where you are in Brazil, that doesn't necessarily hold true with other words using other vowels like fish. Where somebody in Rio might say feixe, somebody from Porto Alegre is not necessarily similarly inclined to pronounce the word in that manner. From a linguistic perspective, this glide is happening because of the tongue's approximation of sounds when getting from a low consonant like an to a higher palatalized sound like s. The raising of the tongue while maintaining a vowel sound results in a diphthong like you hear in I. And although the glide basically corresponds to palatalization in Brazilian speech, the glide has existed in Portuguese in some form or another since Portuguese has existed. The reasons for the appearance of a glide in Portuguese has of course changed over time, and palatalization largely explains why it is present in Portuguese accents of today. This indeed includes Portuguese from Europe. We see the glide in certain contexts in European Portuguese as well. If you've ever heard a Portuguese person say the word fecho or azulejo, you will in fact hear them say faicho or azulejo in a lot of cases. What is happening here in European Portuguese is that the glide is being conditioned by an a vowel sound that has a sh or j sound following it. So therefore you would hear something like faicho, trecho, azulejo, and so on. Because of this, even I can admit that I thought the word azulejo was spelled with an I for an embarrassingly long amount of time. Now, not all European accents feature this glide. And in fact, some other European Portuguese accents, especially those from the islands, feature their own different kind of vowel evolution. This can include differing vowel sounds or even other types of glides or diphthongs in positions where in European Portuguese, in the mainland, we would not normally hear this. So, to sum up, if you've ever heard a Brazilian speaker say MAIS instead of MUS, or a European Portuguese speaker say azulejo instead of azulejo, this is attributed to what is known as a glide. This is most often conditioned by the palatalization of a consonant or word final S sound, whether that be s or sh. And that wraps up today's video. If you enjoyed it, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, leave me a thumbs up down below. You might think about subscribing to my channel if you're not already. I make videos about food, culture, and especially the Portuguese language, which you can find in playlists directly on my channel or in the eye above, and I will see you next time.